You think showing up to church every Sunday makes you spiritually mature. You believe that perfect attendance equals perfect faith. You assume that the person who never misses a service is closer to God than the one who shows up sporadically. Here's the uncomfortable truth that might shatter everything you thought you knew about spiritual growth. The most spiritually mature people in your congregation might be the ones sitting in the back row once a month, not the ones claiming the front pew every week. Church attendance, weekly rituals, prayer meetings, Bible studies, small groups, the endless cycle of religious activities that we've convinced ourselves equals spiritual progress. But what if everything you've been told about spiritual growth is backwards? What if the metrics you've been using to measure your relationship with God are actually keeping you further from the divine than you've ever been? This isn't about abandoning your faith. This is about understanding the hidden psychology behind why some people grow spiritually while others stagnate in religious performance. The truth is that your church attendance pattern reveals far more about your spiritual maturity than you realize, but not in the way you've been taught. Studies suggest that the relationship between frequency of religious service attendance and actual spiritual growth follows a complex psychological pattern that has nothing to do with showing up and everything to do with why you show up. Researchers have identified distinct phases of spiritual development, and each phase corresponds to different attendance behaviors that most people completely misunderstand. Think of spiritual growth like a mountain climb where the summit represents genuine transformation. Most people assume that the climbers who visit base camp every day are making the most progress up the mountain. They see consistent attendance as proof of dedication. But the psychology of spiritual development works more like learning a musical instrument than accumulating religious credits. When you first start playing piano, you need constant practice and structured guidance. This corresponds to what experts call the dependent phase, where new believers benefit enormously from frequent church attendance and consistent community support. During this phase, your spiritual growth actually does correlate with how often you show up. Research indicates that people in this phase who attend services multiple times per week show measurably stronger spiritual development indicators. But something fascinating happens as you progress in your spiritual journey. Just like advanced musicians eventually need less structured practice time and more creative exploration, spiritually maturing individuals often transition into the independent phase of spiritual development. During this phase, the relationship between attendance frequency and spiritual growth becomes inverse. The people who have developed deep spiritual roots often find that excessive religious programming actually hinders their continued growth. Here's the mechanism at work. As you mature spiritually, your relationship with the divine shifts from external validation to internal transformation. You move from needing others to tell you what to believe to discovering what you authentically experience. This natural progression often manifests as decreased traditional church attendance, not because faith is weakening, but because it's becoming more personalized. Meta-analysis of spiritual development studies reveal a surprising pattern that challenges conventional religious thinking. The individuals who score highest on measures of spiritual maturity, compassion, wisdom, and authentic faith often maintain moderate rather than maximum church attendance. They participate in religious community regularly enough to maintain connection and contribute to others' growth, but not so frequently that institutional obligations overshadow personal spiritual exploration. Think of it as the difference between a student who never leaves the classroom and one who applies their learning in the real world. This doesn't mean that people who attend church frequently are spiritually immature. What it means is that attendance frequency alone tells you nothing about spiritual development without understanding the motivation and internal experience behind the behavior. A person who attends every service because they genuinely find spiritual nourishment and growth in community worship is in a very different place than someone who attends every service because they believe God is keeping track of their perfect attendance record. The key distinction lies in what psychologists call intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsically motivated religious participation springs from authentic spiritual hunger, genuine community connection, and natural desire for growth and service. Extrinsically motivated religious participation stems from obligation, fear, social pressure, or desire for religious status and approval. Research consistently shows that people with intrinsic religious motivation demonstrate higher levels of spiritual maturity, psychological well-being, and authentic faith regardless of their attendance frequency. Some of the most spiritually mature individuals go through what researchers call the questioning phase, where they temporarily distance themselves from organized religion to process doubts and explore different perspectives. During this phase, church attendance often decreases dramatically, but spiritual growth may actually accelerate as individuals wrestle with deeper questions and develop more authentic beliefs. Studies suggest that people who never question their faith may remain in spiritual adolescence indefinitely. The questioning phase, though often misunderstood as backsliding, frequently represents a crucial step toward mature faith that can withstand life's challenges. Think about the difference between a teenager who follows rules because their parents will punish them if they don't, and an adult who chooses ethical behavior because they understand its value and consequences. The teenager might have perfect compliance, but the adult has integrated wisdom that guides their choices even when no one is watching. Spiritual maturity works similarly. The person whose faith depends entirely on external religious activities and community pressure has not yet developed the internal spiritual resources that sustain authentic believers through life's inevitable difficulties. This is why some of the most spiritually influential people in history, from contemplative mystics to social justice leaders, often maintain complicated relationships with organized religion. They found that their spiritual growth required periods of solitude, questioning, and exploration that couldn't happen within the confines of regular religious programming. Their decreased attendance didn't indicate spiritual decline, but spiritual evolution beyond what institutional structures could contain or nurture. Consider this fascinating research finding. People who attend religious services primarily for social reasons, family expectations, or habit often score lower on spiritual maturity assessments than those who attend less frequently, but with clear intentional purpose. The difference isn't in the frequency but in the consciousness and intentionality behind the participation. When church attendance becomes automatic routine rather than deliberate spiritual practice, it can actually inhibit the kind of reflection and growth that leads to spiritual transformation. But before you use this information to justify abandoning your religious community entirely, understand that the research also reveals another crucial pattern. People who completely isolate themselves from spiritual community often plateau in their spiritual development just as much as those who over-participate in religious activities. Spiritual growth appears to require a balance between community engagement and personal exploration, between learning from others and developing your own authentic relationship with the divine. The optimal attendance pattern varies dramatically from person to person based on their spiritual development phase, personality type, life circumstances, and authentic spiritual needs. Some people thrive with weekly worship participation supplemented by small group involvement and occasional retreats. Others find their spiritual sweet spot in monthly attendance combined with daily personal spiritual practices and regular service to others outside religious contexts. What matters most is honest self-assessment about your motivations and authentic evaluation of whether your current religious participation pattern is actually fostering spiritual growth or just maintaining spiritual stagnation through religious busyness. Ask yourself whether your church attendance increases your capacity for love, wisdom, compassion, and authentic connection with the divine, or whether it primarily serves to maintain social relationships and personal comfort zones. Here's a practical way to evaluate your own spiritual growth trajectory. Instead of measuring your progress by how often you attend religious services, consider these deeper indicators. Are you becoming more patient with people who think differently than you? Are you developing greater capacity for forgiveness, both of others and yourself? Are you finding more meaning and purpose in your daily life beyond religious activities? Are you becoming more honest about your doubts and questions rather than hiding them? Are you developing spiritual practices that sustain you during difficult times? Are you contributing positively to your community and the world in ways that reflect your deepest values? These indicators of spiritual maturity have little correlation with church attendance frequency, but everything to do with authentic spiritual transformation. You can attend every religious service available and still remain spiritually unchanged if you're not engaging in the internal work of growth and transformation. Conversely, you can attend sporadically and experience profound spiritual development if your participation is intentional and your personal spiritual practice is consistent and meaningful. Remember that this information should never be used to judge others' spiritual development based on their attendance patterns. The person sitting next to you who never misses a service might be in a phase of spiritual development where frequent community participation is exactly what they need for growth. The person you only see once a month might be going through a questioning phase that's leading them toward deeper faith. The person who stopped attending altogether might be in crisis and need community support, or they might be developing contemplative practices that sustain them better than organized worship. The goal isn't to find the perfect attendance formula, but to understand your own spiritual needs and growth patterns honestly. Some seasons of life call for increased community involvement and structured spiritual learning. Other seasons require more solitude, reflection, and personal spiritual exploration. Mature spiritual communities recognize and support both patterns rather than imposing one-size-fits-all expectations that can actually hinder individual spiritual development. What's particularly interesting is how different personality types respond to spiritual community participation. Introverted individuals often find large group worship overwhelming and may experience deeper connection in smaller settings or through solitary practices. Extroverted individuals might thrive in dynamic worship environments, but need encouragement to develop personal spiritual disciplines. Some people are natural contemplatives who find the divine in silence, while others are activists who encounter the sacred through service. Some connect through music and art, while others find nourishment in intellectual study. Healthy spiritual development honors these different pathways rather than forcing everyone into identical participation patterns. This is why the most spiritually mature religious communities tend to offer diverse options for spiritual growth and community involvement rather than expecting everyone to participate in the same activities with the same frequency. They recognize that spiritual development is a highly individual process that requires different resources and support systems at different stages and for different personality types. The bottom line is that your church attendance pattern reveals your spiritual growth stage and motivation, but not in the simplistic way most people assume. Perfect attendance might indicate spiritual maturity, spiritual dependence, social pressure, or simple habit. Sporadic attendance might indicate spiritual decline, spiritual transition, authentic prioritization, or life circumstance challenges. The key is understanding your own pattern honestly and ensuring that your religious participation serves your actual spiritual development rather than just meeting external expectations or maintaining comfortable routines. So, what does your church attendance reveal about your spiritual growth? It reveals where you are in your unique spiritual journey, what motivates your participation in religious community, and whether you're growing toward greater authenticity and spiritual maturity, or remaining stuck in patterns that feel spiritual but don't actually transform your character and consciousness. The path of authentic spiritual development is rarely linear and never identical for any two individuals, but it always involves growing from external dependence toward internal wisdom, from performance toward authenticity. Your attendance pattern is just one indicator among many, and wisdom lies in understanding what it really means for your individual journey, rather than comparing it to anyone else's path. True spiritual maturity shows up not in perfect religious compliance, but in how you love others, face challenges, and contribute to healing in the world. What phase of spiritual development do you think you're in right now, and how might that influence your approach to religious community? Hit that like button if this challenged your assumptions. Subscribe for more content that digs deeper than surface-level spirituality, and share this with someone who might benefit from understanding the psychology behind spiritual growth. Drop a comment about your own experience with church attendance and spiritual development, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.